Hi, welcome back. We are talking about the theory of island biogeography. This is 2.3. Our learning objectives for today are to describe island biogeography and to describe the role of island biogeography in evolution. We will also be understanding habitat fragmentation, which is a subset of island biogeography. So first, what is it? So island biogeography is the study of ecological relationships and community structures on islands. Now, when we talk about island biogeography, it doesn't necessarily have to be the traditional, like what you're seeing in this image, islands. It can actually be something, similar principles can apply to land masses or land that is on land. So separation of land on an actual landmass. It doesn't have to actually be in the water. But for right now, we'll kind of focus on that half later. For right now, we're going to focus on traditionally what you would imagine when you think of an island. So when we talk about island biogeography, the types of relationships and the type of evolution of species that occurs on islands is actually pretty drastically different than what we would anticipate on a really large landmass like we see here. And so what we're going to focus on in this is understanding those relationships, understanding how we get biodiversity on these islands, and some of the rules that may be slightly different based on being away from one large landmass. So what are some of those rules? Larger islands will generally support more total species. So if we go back to this image and we're looking at the Galapagos Islands, traditionally would say whatever island is the biggest is going to have the most, it's going to be able to support the most amount of species. Generally, that's because there's greater ecosystem diversity, which means there's more food, more habitat resources, and more roles that organisms can play within that ecosystem. So the more space you have, the more biodiversity you can support. So that's the first rule of island biogeography. The second one is islands that are closer to the mainland tend to support more species. So this basically says that whatever island is closest to mainland, and in this image, this is the mainland, that one is going to support more species because it's easier for species to get to that island from the mainland. So you think about initial island formation, there's probably nothing living there. Everything that gets there is either swimming or flying. So the closer you are to the mainland, the more likely you are going to get organisms, new colonizing organisms, and the more genetic diversity you're going to have as a result of that. So closer to the mainland and larger in size are going to be the islands that are the most successful. So the smallest islands that are further away will support the fewest number of species. So a little bit more on larger islands. So larger islands tend to have higher ecosystem diversity. So if you're looking at this individual image here, we've got all these different types of zones that exist on this one island. All of these different zones will support different types of species and lead to more species diversity. And then depending, of course, on the relative size, lead to more genetic diversity as we increase the relative populations. There's also going to be more available niches, so more food, more living places, etc. Also, this allows for populations to grow larger, which means we have more genetic diversity, which means we're better able to respond to a disturbance and better able to survive, which means we'll probably have a lower extinction rate happening on these islands. The next one is distance to the mainland. So I really like this image. I think it does a pretty good job. So we've got the mainland represented here, and we see all of this genetic diversity or species diversity. As we get further away from the mainland, we know that species have to travel a much further distance in order to get there. And the only type of interaction we're really seeing in this case is with, like for island C, is really only interacting with island B. So all of their species are coming from whatever landmass is closest to them, and whatever landmass that's closest to them may not have the highest species diversity. So as you increase this distance, you're going to see lower species diversity, lower genetic diversity, and as a result, you're going to see more issues with higher extinction rate, less resources available, etc. So what does that do for evolution on the island? So single colonizing species from mainland quickly evolves to many slightly different species because they have to. So if we have one single colonizing species that goes onto an island, we will see evolution on a much more sped up scale than we normally would. Because there are less resources, because it's a smaller landmass, we have to really see variation in the types of species that exist there because there's going to be a high level of competition. And so a really good example is Darwin's finches. So we have one common ancestor, one common finch that ends up on these islands, but very, very quickly we see these drastic changes so much so that we're experiencing speciation of the finches because there's only so many available resources in terms of seeds, in terms of cactus flowers, in terms of insects, etc. And they have to be able to outcompete each other. So in this case, we see a morphological difference that's really driving that change in speciation. We're seeing like beak sizes. You've probably talked a lot about Darwin's finches and their beak sizes. But speciation will occur much faster. It's going to drive the favorable traits depending on what exists there. And what will quickly happen also is that original ancestor, that original common ancestor, that original colonizing ancestor who probably still exists on the mainland will very quickly not be able to reproduce with any of these new species on the island. Now, I mentioned earlier that island biogeography ideas can also apply to land itself, but land that's been divided up in some particular way. So island biogeography on land is often referred to as habitat fragmentation. And this is where when we generally have one large area that's been divided up into smaller areas, smaller individual areas that are generally isolated from each other. So instead of having one large forest with all of this land, there's something that we generally have done in an anthropogenic way that has now divided that one large space up into much smaller pieces, and for the most part they generally tend to not be connected in any way. So what we're seeing is these individual islands that exist on land that used to be one thing but now have become these distinct land spaces, and they're much smaller than the original piece of land that it all once was. And so habitat fragmentation, as I said, is generally a result of anthropogenic problems. So building roads through forests, that's kind of what you're seeing in this first image. You've created two separate habitats here. Deforestation, that's kind of what you're seeing here, where we've cut down all of the trees in this area, and now we've got trees in this area. And also things like urbanization, so urban sprawl, where we're continuing to build in areas that would otherwise be a natural habitat for living things. When we do this, we create kind of a multitude of problems. It separates breeding populations, so I'll use this example. Let's say we have population of deer. Some deer are going to end up on this side, some deer are going to end up on that side. We've now separated a population from being able to breed with each other. So you're probably going to end up with two very genetically diverse populations of deer on either side. But by doing this, you're also decreasing the gene pool. So you've got this side, which is going to have far fewer genes, and this side, which now has far fewer genes to pull from. And so you have a much smaller gene pool. This can lead to something called an inbreeding depression, where the genes are so similar that individuals within the same population who are breeding together are breeding with genes that are too similar to their own, and that can cause genetic mutation. It can also decrease resource availability. Perhaps the deer who end up on this side of the freeway or road no longer have access to the water source that they were used to getting water at. Maybe there isn't a water source over here. So it can decrease their resource availability. Perhaps what they used to prey on lives on this side but not on this side, so it can change their feeding patterns. all of those can lead to things like die-off or extinction because you've changed their living situation so drastically. You also create something called a core habitat versus an edge habitat. So in this image, where all this dense, massive trees are, these are going to be the core habitat. It's what resembles the original habitat the most, versus an edge habitat is going to be literally the line where the trees end. And you can see there's a very distinct line in really both of these images. And so the edge habitat is always going to have less resources. It's going to be susceptible to wind, to fire. There's going to be less water. There's going to be less niches available. And so you've created now this whole thing, because now this whole thing, it has an edge to it. And you've created this whole barrier where it significantly decreases the availability of living spaces for other things. So how do we combat this? One way is through something called habitat corridors. Habitat corridors are literally these pathways that are created to connect islands on land, that prevent some of those negative effects of habitat fragmentation. So if we put in these bridges, almost these pathways that connect these spaces of land that maybe have been separated by roads or urbanization or whatever it may be, then we can prevent things like inbreeding depressions, because we can see a migration of genes through each of these. This is called metapopulations, or an introduction of metapopulations. So we know that we have metapopulations we have small gene pools of, say, deer in each one of these. But if I see a migration of some genes from this one over to this one, into this next metapopulation, I can see an increase in gene flow. There's also going to be more resources available. So if I don't have the resources I need here, I can make my way over through one of these habitat corridors to resources that are available to me here. And of course, all of this decreases the species' chance of dying off. One way that we have tried to create habitat corridors are things called land bridges, and that's what you're seeing in this image. So you can see we're experiencing habitat fragmentation here because we've built this massive freeway. So in order to combat that, we've created this land bridge over the freeway, which is meant to mimic the same types of conditions that are being experienced in each of these habitats, so that critters like deer or whatever ecosystem you're in can cross over to the other side and back in order to access resources, decrease inbreeding populations, increase gene flow, and decrease the chances of die-off. So they've actually put these in a lot of places, and they've been fairly successful. There's actually nature cams you can watch on land bridges where you can see species that are actually using the land bridge to get to the other side. The only issue with land bridges actually is there's no place to hide once you're on the bridge. So if a predator, now predators are learning that if they hang out on land bridges and their prey has to cross, there's really nowhere for that prey to go or hide. So they're kind of able to hunt them there. So it's kind of created a disturbance in predator-prey relationships in that way. But for the most part, it does allow for a natural or a human-made habitat corridor to exist and connect two ecosystems that may be fragmented. Okay, last slide here. So there's this acronym. It's called SLOSS, and it stands for single, large, or several small. So there's a lot of arguments for sort of determining what the best method is for maintaining biodiversity. Is it better to have one large landmass area, or is it better to have several small? There's kind of an argument for both. A lot of people say that one large area is better than a lot of smaller preserves because it's got a large enough area. All of the resources are there. You don't have to worry about inbreeding depressions or lack of gene flow. There's more of a core habitat and less edge habitat, so you're able to support more species in one area. Others would argue that small reserves have a greater variety of habitats, which can increase biodiversity, and as a result of that increased biodiversity, you're more likely to see species that are able to withstand some type of disturbance or catastrophe, which would eliminate all species. So there's arguments for both here. Okay, I think that's it for today. Let me know if you have questions, and we'll talk about this more in class. Thanks.